Hey guys, tonight we are heading deep into the Persian desert, long after the sun has dipped below the horizon and the stars are so sharp they look like someone just poked holes in the night sky. You feel the day's heat still clinging to the ground, radiating up through your sandals, but the air is cooling fast. There's something magical about this stillness, no honking cars, no glowing screens, just the hush of wind brushing over dunes. And right there, under that breathtaking sky, you have a problem. Tomorrow, the king expects ice for his sherbet. Yes, actual ice, in the middle of the desert, and if you fail, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this royal dinner party. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere far away, tell me your city and the time right now. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start walking toward a looming, beehive-shaped structure that seems to rise out of the earth itself. Its walls glow faintly under the moon, made from sun-baked mud brick, sloped so steeply that climbing it would be a serious core workout. This is a yakshul, literally, ice pit, and it's going to be your salvation. Standing before it feels strange, part giant sandcastle, part spaceship, part ancient miracle of engineering. It is silent now, but inside, ice is waiting. The Persians were masters of this craft. Long before electricity or humming refrigerators, they figured out how to freeze, store, and serve ice through the sweltering summer months. The basic trick? Build huge, insulated domes with deep underground chambers and funnel winter's ice inside. It sounds simple enough, but as you trace your hand along the cool mud surface, you start realizing just how much thought went into every curve, every brick. Historians still argue whether these structures were designed first for water storage or specifically for ice, but either way, their brilliance is undeniable. You picture workers from centuries ago trudging through the cold nights, hauling ice from nearby streams or small ponds, dragging it here by mule or by sheer back strength. The desert may be blazing by day, but winter nights can freeze water solid, giving villagers a precious seasonal supply. You imagine yourself on one of those nights, your breath fogging in the air, your hands raw from gripping slick blocks of ice, and a friend muttering jokes about why you didn't become a poet instead. And the size of this thing. Some yakshuls were over 15 meters high and could hold tons of ice, enough to last an entire summer. The inside was carefully designed, sloped floors, drainage channels, and a clever ventilation system that used the desert's own dry winds to keep the temperature low. You step closer to the arched doorway and feel that first cool draft kiss your skin. It's like opening a freezer after a long run, except here, there's no electric hum, no light bulb, just perfect darkness and silence. Standing here, you realize this wasn't just about staying cool. Ice meant status. It meant you could impress guests with chilled rosewater drinks and frozen desserts, even when the desert sun was punishing everything in sight. It meant that you had power, resources, and clever engineers working for you. The yakshul isn't just a building, it's a flex. Still, the night is long, and you have work to do. You duck inside the entrance, your steps muffled by packed earth. The air grows noticeably colder, and your shoulders tense involuntarily. This is your first glimpse of what Persian ingenuity feels like in action, a pocket of winter in the heart of the desert. Somewhere in the darkness, ice is stacked carefully, waiting to be chipped into pieces and carted to tomorrow's banquet. For a moment, you let yourself just stand there and breathe in that rare, cool air. It smells faintly of wet clay, like a cave after rain. And as you lean against the wall, you can almost hear distant laughter, the echoes of past workers celebrating a job well done, knowing that when the summer sun returned, their families would have water, cold drinks, maybe even a bit of sherbet to share. You smile in the dark. Somehow, this place feels alive. You blink a few times, letting your eyes adjust to the dim interior, and soon the shape of the yakshul around you becomes clearer. The space feels cavernous, like you've stepped inside a hollow mountain. The domed ceiling curves upward so high you could almost believe a genie lives up there. The walls taper smoothly, thick enough that you suspect you could park a camel sideways inside them. That thickness is the secret weapon here, a combination of insulation and patience. This whole structure is essentially an ancient refrigerator, except no one had to plug it in, change the light bulb, or clear out suspicious leftovers. The Persians figured out that if you dig deep enough, the ground temperature stays relatively stable all year. Pair that with heavy, heat-resistant walls made from a special mixture of sand, clay, ash, goat hair, and lime, yes, goat hair, because apparently even ancient refrigeration required a touch of fashion, and you've got a desert fortress against heat. Archaeologists still marvel at this mortar because it's not just strong, it's nearly waterproof. Historians still argue whether the secret recipe was discovered by accident, maybe from a happy mud-mixing mishap, or if it was carefully refined over generations. You walk slowly along the curved wall, running your fingertips over the surface. It feels slightly gritty, almost like chalk, but cool to the touch. Every few meters there are small vents, narrow openings that let air circulate. At night, when desert winds sweep through, they act like nature's air conditioner, drawing warm air out and keeping the chamber chilly. You can almost picture a Persian engineer grinning smugly as he explained to the local governor, "See? No magic required, just physics and wind." There's another marvel hidden outside, the shallow ice pools. These were man-made basins where water could freeze on the coldest winter nights. Imagine standing there under a desert sky, water glittering with a thin crust of ice, waiting until just before dawn to break it up and haul it inside. You'd have to work fast before the sun appeared and ruined everything. And yes, in case you're wondering, slipping and falling into one of these pools would have been a terrible way to start your shift. As you move deeper into the chamber, you notice the floor slopes toward a central pit. This wasn't just a quirky design choice, it was to drain melted ice away so the rest wouldn't sit in a puddle and vanish into thin air. There's something satisfying about how logical it all is. You find yourself nodding and thinking, okay, that's clever, like you're silently approving the work of architects who have been dead for 2,000 years. In your mind's eye, you see the Yakshul in full operation, teams of workers forming a human chain, passing heavy blocks of ice down into the pit, layering them with straw or sawdust for insulation. It's a slow, careful process, and you can almost hear the rhythmic thuds of ice being set into place, the quiet grunts of laborers, and the murmured jokes passed back and forth. Maybe one man complains that his sandals are soaked, another teases him that at least the ice will keep the smell down. You step closer to the center and imagine standing right where the ice would have been stacked, feeling the weight of hundreds of blocks above you, each one a little miracle of captured winter. The space feels strangely sacred, like a church built for the sole worship of cold. And perhaps, in a way, it was. After all, the Yakshul was more than storage, it was a symbol of mastery over nature, proof that humans could carve out little oases of comfort in a brutal climate. The thought makes you chuckle softly. Humans will do anything for a chilled drink, won't they? We build entire domes in deserts just to keep our sorbets from melting. You tilt your head, listening to the faint sound of wind whistling through one of the vents, and it almost sounds like a lullaby. The desert outside may still be unforgiving, but in here, you can relax for a moment. When you finally step back toward the entrance, the cool air brushes against your face again, and for a moment you just stand there, feeling a little smug yourself. You've just uncovered the blueprint for surviving the summer like a Persian king. And tomorrow, when the court gathers, you'll be ready. You step outside again, and the desert night greets you with a crisp bite. The stars are still burning overhead, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks, maybe annoyed at the late-night commotion. Tonight is ice harvesting night, and you have a front-row seat. You trudge toward the shallow ice pools, your breath puffing in white clouds. The ground crunches beneath your sandals, the thin layer of frost sparkling like spilled sugar. This is where the real labor begins. Villagers are already gathered, bundled in wool cloaks, their faces hidden except for glinting eyes. They carry wooden chisels, rope, and baskets lined with straw. You watch them kneel at the edge of the pool, break the surface with satisfying cracks, and pry up slabs of ice. The blocks are surprisingly thick, proof that the desert can freeze solid if you give it the right conditions: clear skies, still air, and a long enough winter night. You squat down and touch the edge of a block. It bites at your fingertips, sharp as glass, and you pull back with a hiss, secretly glad this isn't your full-time job. Each chunk is hauled out carefully, stacked near the edge, and wrapped in straw like a baby swaddled for its first winter outing. There's a rhythm to the work that is almost hypnotic: crack, lift, scrape, wrap, pass. Someone hums softly under his breath, and soon others join in, turning the night into a quiet chorus. Historians still argue whether this harvest was a community-wide event, almost like a festival, or just backbreaking labor done by hired workers. You can imagine both being true: villagers gathering with lanterns, sharing gossip, maybe passing around a steaming pot of tea to keep warm. Then comes the hauling. Long wooden sledges, yes, sledges in the desert, are dragged by teams of donkeys or oxen. You help load the ice, your muscles straining as the cold seeps through the straw and numbs your fingers. Once loaded, the caravan creaks toward the Yakshal, every footstep crunching softly in the frozen ground. The moonlight turns the desert silver, and you think for a moment that this must be what walking across another planet feels like: silent, glowing, and slightly surreal. You catch the eye of another worker trudging beside you. He grins, teeth flashing, and jokes that at least tonight they don't have to worry about snakes: the cold has chased them all into hiding. You laugh, realizing that in the daytime, this same path would be scorching and deadly, the very air rippling with heat. The contrast is startling. The desert, you think, has two personalities: one that tries to melt you and one that helps you freeze water for tomorrow. By the time you return to the Yakshal, your arms are aching and your nose is running. Inside, torches flicker as more workers form a chain, passing ice blocks hand to hand into the pit. The interior fills with the sound of ice sliding against stone, straw rustling, and the occasional yelp when someone drops a chunk on their foot. A few of the men start a friendly contest, trying to see who can carry the biggest block without slipping. You cheer for them quietly, amused by the thought that ancient Persians were basically the first CrossFit enthusiasts. When the last load is stacked, everyone takes a moment to stand still, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. There is pride in their faces: this is more than just storage, this is security. The ice they've saved tonight will keep food fresh, cool water through blistering months, and provide the luxury of chilled desserts when everyone else is wilting. You look down at your hands, red and stinging, and feel oddly triumphant too. You've just participated in a ritual that has been repeated for centuries, under stars that have seen it all before. And as you turn to leave, you glance back at the Yakshal, now full and silent, holding its treasure of winter inside. Tomorrow, the sun will rise, blazing and merciless, but for now you've trapped a little piece of the cold in a mud brick dome. It's almost poetic, like bottling a season. When morning finally arrives, the desert begins to change personality again. The stars fade, the horizon glows pink, and soon the first rays of sun creep over the dunes. You squint against the light, already feeling the heat sharpening, but you know the secret to keeping cool runs far deeper than anything you can see on the surface. Somewhere nearby, hidden under the earth like a sleeping dragon, lies a network of kanats, ancient underground water canals that quietly keep this place alive. You crouch down and imagine what's beneath your feet: miles of sloping tunnels, carved with painstaking care, guiding fresh water from distant mountain aquifers straight into the settlement. It's ingenious, really. By keeping the water underground, the Persians protected it from evaporation and kept it cool, almost refrigerator cold by the time it reached the Yakshal. You follow the gentle downward slope of the land until you reach one of the vertical access shafts, just wide enough for a person to climb down. Peering into the darkness is dizzying, like looking into the throat of the earth. Cool air drifts upward, and you feel a tiny shiver run down your back. You picture the men who dug these tunnels by hand, crawling for hours underground with nothing but oil lamps and determination. Historians still argue whether some of these tunnels were dug by free labor or by prisoners, and whether the workers were paid in coin or in the promise of water for their villages. Either way, it was backbreaking work, and the reward was survival itself. You imagine lowering yourself carefully down the shaft, hands scraping against the smooth earth, until you drop into the tunnel below. Down here, it's hushed and cool, the air damp with the faint scent of clay. The sound of trickling water echoes around you, almost like someone playing a quiet flute. The cannet runs in a shallow trench, just deep enough to channel the water along its gentle slope. You crouch and dip your fingers into it. It's cold, shockingly so, like mountain snowmelt. If you follow it long enough, you would eventually reach its source, a mother well, sometimes dug several kilometers away in the foothills. These wells could be deep enough to make you dizzy just thinking about the climb down. Once tapped, the water began its slow journey toward the settlement, guided entirely by gravity. No pumps, no gears, just clever math and careful surveying. It's one of those moments where you have to stop and give the ancient engineers a silent round of applause. Back above ground, you notice a series of small mounds dotting the desert in a neat line. These are the tops of the access shafts, spaced every few dozen meters. They look like little chimneys, breathing air into the earth. They're also practical. Workers could climb down for repairs or to clear blockages when necessary. You grin at the thought of someone thousands of years ago inventing the first maintenance schedule. Check shaft number 12 before it floods the whole village. The beauty of the cannet system is that it didn't just serve the Yakshal. It also fed orchards, gardens, and drinking wells, turning otherwise barren land into productive farmland. Imagine rows of pomegranate trees blooming in a place where rain might only fall twice a year. The cool water flowed silently beneath their roots, keeping them alive through blistering summers. Walking back toward the Yakshal, you think about how this underground water highway is really the hidden partner in tonight's ice harvesting ritual. Without it, there'd be no water to freeze in the first place. The whole system feels like a secret pact with nature, taking just enough water to live, while hiding it safely from the brutal sun. Of course, you can't help but chuckle at the thought that somewhere, inevitably, a goat must have fallen into one of these shafts at least once in history. It's almost too easy to imagine a panicked shepherd yelling into the darkness while his goat bleated indignantly at the bottom. You grin at the absurdity, the sound echoing in your head as you picture the rescue mission that followed. The sun is higher now, and the desert is warming quickly, but just knowing the cannets are there makes you feel oddly secure. Beneath your feet, cold water is traveling silently, patiently, bringing the mountains to the desert one drop at a time. It's not just technology, it's hope, carved into the earth itself. By the time you reach the Yakshal again, the air outside has already turned sharp with heat, shimmering above the sand like invisible flames. You duck back into the cool darkness, grateful for the relief, and your eyes slowly find the sloping floor beneath your feet. It's not flat, never was. The entire interior was designed with a purpose, and now you start noticing the genius behind every angle. The floor inclines gently toward a deep central basin, like a giant earthen funnel. This is where the ice was stacked, block by block, until the pit was full. Meltwater would trickle down toward the very bottom, where it drained away through narrow channels, preventing the remaining ice from sitting in a puddle and melting faster. It's a small detail, but you realize it's the difference between having ice in midsummer and standing around wondering why your sherbet tastes like lukewarm regret. As you pace the floor, you picture the workers from last night filling this very space. They'd lay the first layer of ice, sprinkle straw between blocks to keep them from fusing together, and then stack the next layer slightly offset, like building a giant frozen Jenga tower. The air temperature inside would drop with every new block until your breath turned cloudy. Pretty soon the Yakshal itself became a natural refrigerator, holding the chill like a dragon hoarding treasure. And then there's the airflow system. You notice narrow channels along the lower walls leading toward small vents. These acted like wind tunnels, drawing cooler night air inside and letting warmer air escape out the top vent near the dome. It's basically a passive cooling system, no electricity required. Historians still argue whether some of these air shafts were adjusted seasonally by adding or removing plugs, but it makes sense. Why waste precious cool air in winter when you're trying to store it for summer? You pause and tilt your head toward the dome's apex, half expecting a breeze to whisper down. Instead, the silence is heavy, but you can almost imagine the faint whoosh of air rushing through when the wind outside is strong. It's eerie and comforting all at once, like standing inside the lungs of some giant sleeping animal. Near the entrance, you spot traces of plaster on the walls, evidence of how carefully these chambers were sealed. The waterproofing was legendary, a mix of clay, ash, lime, egg whites, and goat hair. Yes, goat hair again. Apparently goats were the unsung heroes of ancient refrigeration. The mixture formed a coating so smooth that water barely seeped through, keeping the interior dry and preventing structural damage. Some of these walls still stand centuries later, defying sandstorms, rain, and time itself. You kneel and touch the ground, cool against your palm, and try to imagine what this would feel like at the height of summer, when everything outside is scorching and this interior is a sanctuary of cold. Perhaps it was a community gathering spot of sorts, a place where people would come to collect ice or cool water. You can almost hear children running to the entrance, shrieking at the first blast of chilly air, or a cook grumbling that someone took the last clean block for their fancy dessert. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine being the engineer tasked with designing this masterpiece. No computers, no modern thermometers, just observation, intuition, and trial and error. Maybe you spent years refining the slope of the floor, making sure the drainage worked perfectly, cursing when the first version flooded and ruined half the ice. But eventually, you got it right, and when the yachtshell stayed cool through the entire summer, you probably strutted around like the smartest person in the empire. And honestly, you were. This was more than architecture. It was environmental engineering centuries ahead of its time, a marriage of math, geography, and a very human desire for comfort. You can't help but smile at the thought that while some people were busy building palaces and monuments, others were quietly solving the problem of, how do I keep my drink cold in July? As you stand there, listening to the muffled quiet, the design of the place starts to feel elegant, even artistic. The sloping floor, the vents, the dome, they're not just practical. They're beautiful in their simplicity, like a poem written in mud brick. And for a second, you feel a strange kinship with the builders, as though they're nodding at you through the centuries, pleased that you noticed how clever they were. Your footsteps echo softly as you trace the curve of the wall, still thinking about that smooth plaster. The further you walk, the more fascinated you become by the material itself. It doesn't just look durable, it feels purposeful, like it was made with secret knowledge passed down through generations. This plaster, or sarouge as it was called, wasn't your average mud mix. It was a carefully guarded blend of clay, sand, lime, ash, and yes, once again, goat hair, mixed with water until it formed a thick paste. Workers spread it over the walls and floor, layer by layer, until the entire interior gleamed with a pale, smooth finish. When it dried, it became almost impermeable. You kneel down and press your palm against it, half expecting it to crumble, but no, it holds steady, as if shrugging off the centuries. Archaeologists who have studied surviving yakshals have tested sarouge and found it surprisingly water-resistant, even against standing pools. That means any meltwater trickling down into the pit stayed where it was supposed to, no seeping into the ground and attracting snakes, no flooding the chamber. Historians still argue whether the secret recipe for sarouge changed from region to region, or whether there was one master formula shared across Persia. Either way, it was brilliant enough that some modern engineers have tried recreating it for eco-friendly construction projects. As you imagine the workers mixing this magic mud, you can practically smell the earthy tang of ash and lime, see the steam rising as they stirred it in big pits with shovels. Maybe a foreman walked around, grumbling about consistency, too watery, add more ash. While kids stood nearby, giggling as they tried to leave handprints in the wet plaster before being shooed away. Once applied, the walls would have been left to dry in the sun, forming a hard shell that protected the ice from both heat and dust storms. You glance toward the narrow entrance and picture a summer day when a gust of wind kicks up a mini sandstorm outside. Inside, though, the yachtshell remains calm and pristine, the sarouge walls quietly doing their job. Then there's the roof, which may have been patched and recoated every few years. You imagine clambering up there with a bucket of wet mix, balancing carefully while your friend below shouted tips, or just shouted that you'd better not fall in. If this was a community effort, everyone probably knew the maintenance schedule. The yakshul was as essential as the village well, and letting it crack or leak would have been a disaster. And while the plaster was mostly practical, you wonder if some yakshuls were decorated. Perhaps patterns were carved into the wet surface, or symbols painted on the dome, something to show off civic pride. After all, if your village had the best preserved ice pit in the region, you'd want to brag a little. You run your fingertips along a faint groove in the wall, and for a second, you imagine it as a doodle left by a bored mason centuries ago. There's something oddly comforting about that thought. Someone stood in this exact spot, probably sweating despite the cold, leaving their tiny mark in wet plaster. It strikes you that this mix of mud, ash, and hair is really a kind of alchemy. It turned ordinary materials into something extraordinary, something that could hold back the desert itself. And while it might sound funny to call goat hair a miracle ingredient, you can't deny its importance here. You smirk to yourself and think, move over, golden fleece, this is the real legend. Outside, the sun climbs higher, but in here, you barely feel it. The Suruj is doing what it has done for centuries, locking the heat out, holding the cold in, and giving you just a little more time to enjoy this pocket of winter. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the smooth, ancient walls, you feel like you've been let in on a secret that very few people ever get to know. You lean against the cool wall, letting your mind wander, and suddenly you realize there's still one more secret at play here, not just walls and pits, but physics itself. Step outside, and the desert sun is now blazing overhead, yet the air feels oddly crisp near the surface of the yakshul. You squint, noticing the faintest shimmer along the outer dome, like heat is being stolen away. This is evaporative cooling, one of nature's oldest tricks, and you're standing inside a giant version of it. The porous mud brick surface of the yakshul lets a tiny amount of moisture seep through. As it evaporates under the sun, it takes heat with it, lowering the temperature inside. It's the same principle that makes you shiver when sweat dries on your skin, except here it works in slow motion, hour after hour, day after day. You crouch and run your hand along the base of the dome. It feels almost damp in places, as though the building itself is sweating to keep the ice safe. You grin at the image, a giant clay snowman refusing to melt. The effect is subtle but powerful. Paired with the underground depth, thick insulation, and smart ventilation, it keeps the interior cool even when the desert is hot enough to fry flatbread on a rock. In your mind, you imagine a summer day centuries ago, villagers gathering near the dome, wiping sweat from their foreheads, stepping one by one into the yakshul to fetch ice. Each time the door opens, a blast of chilled air rushes out, and everyone gasps like they've just opened a treasure chest. Someone probably cracked a joke about charging admission, because who wouldn't want to hang out inside the only cool building for miles? You look up toward the dome's peak and picture warm air slowly rising, finding its way out through the vent at the top. This constant airflow is key. Without it, the inside would grow stuffy and humid, and the ice would melt faster. Historians still argue whether some of the larger yakshuls doubled as wind catchers, deliberately channeling breezes into the dome for extra cooling. The idea seems plausible. You've seen wind catcher towers in Persian architecture before, rising like chimneys to grab the faintest breath of air. Standing there, you can feel it, the faintest whisper of wind swirling past your ankles. Maybe it's your imagination, or maybe it's the desert's natural air conditioning quietly humming along. Either way, you're impressed. As you step back outside, you notice how the shadow of the dome moves slowly across the sand, shading the shallow ice pool that was used last night. This wasn't accidental. Many yakshuls were built with tall walls on their sunny side to block the fiercest afternoon rays, giving the freezing pools a better chance to form ice at night. You find yourself nodding again. These builders didn't just trust nature, they worked with it, coaxed it, nudged it until it played along. You take a deep breath, inhaling the dry air. The desert smells different when the sun is high, sharper, dustier, with a faint metallic tang. It makes you appreciate just how miraculous this cooling system really is. Without it, storing ice would be impossible, and all your effort from last night would have turned into a puddle by now. And, of course, you can't resist one last joke to yourself: this is basically the original smart home. No apps, no Wi-Fi, just a building that cools itself, drains itself, and even smells faintly like sun-baked earth. As you step back inside one more time, you feel the temperature difference again, the sudden drop that makes your shoulders relax. The evaporative cooling is working, and so is the clever design. This isn't just ancient technology, it's a kind of quiet, ongoing performance, one that keeps repeating year after year as long as someone cares for the dome. And tonight, when the stars are back and the desert has cooled again, the process will begin all over, nature and human ingenuity keeping their strange, delicate dance. You wake the next morning to the sound of voices outside, low, steady chatter, the kind of conversation that only happens when people are doing something repetitive and slightly heavy. You rub the sleep from your eyes, step out into the pale dawn light, and there they are, a small team of workers hauling baskets of straw and clay. Today, you get to see the yakshal get repaired and maintained, because, like anything clever and complicated, these ice houses only work if someone keeps them from falling apart. You watch as one man climbs a wooden ladder propped against the dome. He moves carefully, like a spider, carrying a pail of wet clay. Each time he reaches a cracked spot, he slaps on a fresh layer of plaster-like mortar, smoothing it with a wooden paddle. You can hear the satisfying, wet thwack from where you stand. The smell of damp earth rises with each repair, and you realize this is the same material that made the dome in the first place: mud mixed with sand, ash, goat hair, and sometimes lime. It's not fancy, but it does the job, and it's cheap enough to renew every season. Down below, another worker gathers loose straw and packs it against the dome's base. Keeps the sun off, someone explains with a grin. You crouch to touch it and find it springy, faintly sweet-smelling, like a barn floor. You can't help but picture a massive desert hamster bedding down for the night. Maintenance is not optional out here. Without a good seal, the dome would lose its insulating power and let in hot air, ruining the ice inside. Historians still argue whether some villages held annual yakshal festivals, where maintenance became a community event, everyone patching, whitewashing, and blessing the structure before the brutal heat of summer set in. You watch as the workers move on to the ventilation shaft, clearing out sand and dust with long, flexible branches. One man shouts something down the shaft, and a faint echo bounces back. Still breathing, he says with a nod, satisfied that the airflow is unobstructed. By mid-morning, the work shifts to the interior. You follow them down the narrow steps into the cool chamber, where they scrape away thin layers of meltwater residue that have frozen and thawed unevenly. The sound is a soft, rhythmic scraping that somehow makes the place feel even more peaceful, like someone sharpening a giant pencil underground. The floor is swept clean, and buckets of fresh straw are scattered along the edges to soak up any future drips. One of the older workers leans against his broom and catches your eye. "You know," he says, "ice is stubborn. If you leave it too long, it grows fangs." He points to a stalactite forming on the inner wall. You grin. Apparently, even here in the desert, you get a touch of winter cave magic. You step back outside to give them space, letting the morning sun warm your face. It's a good reminder that these structures weren't static. They were living pieces of infrastructure, constantly needing attention, like a pet, or maybe like a very picky roommate who hates drafts. You imagine the kind of community knowledge it took to keep one of these running, every child growing up knowing which crack to patch, which direction the straw wall faced, how to clear a clogged drain without flooding the chamber. The work probably came with gossip, too. This must have been prime time to trade stories, pass along news, and maybe sneak a complaint about the price of goat cheese. As the sun climbs higher, the workers finish their tasks and step back, admiring their handiwork. The dome now gleams slightly in the bright light, freshly sealed, ready for another season of service. It's funny, you came here to learn about ancient refrigeration, but watching the teamwork, the joking, the quiet pride, you realize you're really learning about people. The technology is amazing, sure, but it's the human rhythm that keeps it alive. You sit down in the shade of the dome, pulling your knees up and breathing in the faint scent of wet clay and desert dust. Somewhere nearby, someone starts to sing, a low, wandering tune with no clear words. You find yourself smiling. Even maintenance day feels a little magical out here. You wake from a short nap, still sitting in the dome's shadow, and notice a new group approaching, this time, no clay or straw in sight. Instead, they're carrying baskets lined with cloth and filled with something that glitters faintly. You get closer and realize it's salt, piles and piles of it. Today isn't just about keeping the dome standing, it's about stockpiling ice for the summer. You step into the cool chamber again, this time following the workers as they begin layering the remaining ice with thick blankets of straw and sprinklings of salt. The salt catches the dim light like tiny stars, and for a moment it feels like you're standing under a night sky trapped underground. The process is methodical: ice, straw, salt, repeat. Each layer forms insulation that slows melting even further. One worker explains with a shrug, salt keeps it cold longer. You nod, thinking about the science behind it. You've probably seen this at home, maybe in a hand-crank ice cream maker, where salt helps lower the freezing point of water. Here, that means the ice stays solid even when the chamber temperature creeps a bit higher. You watch the process and try not to think of it as making a giant underground lasagna. Still, the resemblance is there, layer upon layer, carefully pressed down. By the end of the morning, the ice pile looks like a neat, straw-covered mound. Someone jokes that it's the most valuable loaf of bread in the empire. Outside, a donkey brays, and you wander over to find another group unloading more ice blocks brought in from a distant mountain stream. This is where the logistics get interesting. Historians still argue whether some Persian cities imported large quantities of ice overland, or whether they mostly relied on the shallow night-frozen pools we saw earlier. You picture a convoy of camels, each one carrying a block wrapped in wool, trundling across the desert like the most delicate delivery service ever. You reach out and touch one of the fresh blocks, shocked at how solid and glassy it feels under your fingers. Your hand comes away wet, and you laugh to yourself. Yes, in the middle of this scorched plain, you just got your hands soaked with mountain snowmelt. Then comes the clever part: after enough ice is gathered, they seal the chamber for long-term storage. The big door gets wedged shut with a mud brick barrier, plastered tight so no warm air can sneak in. You watch them smooth the final layer until it looks almost seamless, like a patch of ordinary wall. It's strange to think that, from this point on, nobody will step inside for weeks, maybe months. The ice becomes a kind of hidden treasure, waiting for the hottest part of the year. While they work, a few kids from the village linger nearby, hoping for scraps of ice. One of the older men chips off a small sliver and hands it to them. The kids shriek at the shock of cold in their hands, then immediately pop the pieces into their mouths, crunching happily. You can't help but grin. Apparently, ancient Persian children invented snow cones centuries before the rest of us caught on. The sun climbs higher, and soon the workers are done. The last tools are gathered, and the dome stands silent again. This time, though, you feel its weight differently, because you know it's full, brimming with ice that might save lives when the temperature reaches its brutal peak. As you walk back toward the village, you notice how relaxed everyone seems now that the ice is stored. The anxiety of preparation has passed. Tonight there might even be a small feast, someone whispers, an excuse to celebrate another season's supply secured. You think about how many such cycles have happened here: ice gathered, stored, melted, and gathered again. Like the desert itself, the rhythm is endless, predictable, comforting. Before you leave, you take one last glance at the dome, glowing softly in the afternoon light. It doesn't look like much to an outsider, just a clay bump in the sand, but you know better now. Inside is a cool pocket of winter, patiently waiting for its moment. The next day, you're invited to stay in the village for something even more intriguing: actually using the ice. The sun is already high and merciless, the air shivering with heat, when a small group heads toward the Yakshal. You tag along, excited and slightly smug that you already know what's hidden inside. When they chip away the mud brick seal and pull open the wooden door, a cool rush of air hits your face. It smells faintly of wet straw, cold clay, and something mineral, like the inside of a cave. Your shoulders instantly relax. The villagers step carefully inside, prying free blocks of ice from the straw layers with picks and wooden mallets. The sound is satisfyingly crisp, echoing off the domed chamber. Once outside, the blocks are wrapped in cloth and carried toward the village square. It turns out today's ice isn't just for storage, it's for food and drink. You follow them to a shady courtyard where a table is already set with clay pitchers and shallow bowls. This is where you see one of the coolest, pun entirely intended, uses of this technology: chilled drinks and sorbet-like desserts. One woman starts by shaving the ice into thin flakes with a curved knife, piling them into a bowl like fresh snow. Over this she pours pomegranate syrup so dark it looks almost black in the shade. The syrup soaks in, turning the ice a deep ruby color. You're handed a small spoon carved from wood and given a taste. It's shockingly cold against your tongue, sweet tart and refreshing. You close your eyes and imagine ancient Persian kings doing exactly this, sitting in lush palace gardens with fountains trickling nearby. Historians still argue whether the word sharbat, which eventually gave us sherbet and syrup, first referred to drinks like this or to more medicinal tonics. Either way, you're suddenly very glad someone thought to mix ice with fruit syrup. As the day goes on, you watch other uses for the ice. Small chunks are dropped into clay jars of milk, cooling them quickly so they don't spoil. A nearby cook adds slivers to a pot of wine, muttering that warm wine is only for barbarians. Children run up and beg for their own little chips to suck on, giggling at the chill. It's a festival atmosphere, but with a practical side. This ice is rationed carefully, saved for the sick, the elderly, or moments when morale needs a boost. You find yourself thinking about how this simple luxury must have shaped life here. Suddenly, summer isn't just something to endure, it's something to celebrate, with icy drinks and rare, cold treats. This must have made Persian villages feel like small miracles in the desert. Later in the day, a traveler arrives from another settlement, dusty and weary. He's handed a cup of chilled water, and you watch the relief on his face as he drinks deeply, shoulders slumping with gratitude. In a place like this, ice isn't just a convenience, it's hospitality, even mercy. Standing in the shade, you imagine word spreading along the trade routes: come to this town, they have ice. You picture merchants bringing news, spices, silk, and also the latest gossip about whose yakshal was the biggest or lasted longest that summer. Maybe there were even a little bit of rivalry, an ancient version of today's best refrigeration system, bragging rights. As the sun begins to set, the remaining ice is carefully packed back into the chamber, the door resealed, the mud plaster smoothed once again. There's something ritualistic about it, as though everyone silently thanks the dome for sharing its treasure and promises to take care of it until next time. You linger until the last light fades from the sky, sipping the final drops of melted pomegranate ice from your bowl. Somewhere nearby, a musician plays a slow, lilting tune on a reed flute, the notes rising like cool air into the warm night. For the first time in days, you actually forget how hot the desert is. And yes, you can't help but smirk. This is probably the earliest recorded instance of beating the heat. No electric freezers, no ice makers, just human patience, clever design, and a whole lot of teamwork. You wake up before dawn the next morning, drawn by the soft murmur of voices outside your door. Today, you've been told, you'll learn how this icy treasure connects not just to survival but to the empire's economy. You follow a small caravan as it sets out from the village, 2 donkeys, 3 men, and bundles wrapped tight in wool. Inside those bundles, chunks of ice from the Yakshal, destined for a nearby town. The air is cool at this hour, almost gentle, and you can see your breath just faintly in the glow of starlight. The group moves quickly, knowing that every moment of delay means more melting. One of the men jokes that by the time they get there, they might just be delivering very fancy puddles. You laugh softly, but you can tell they're serious about efficiency. Historians still argue about just how far ice was traded in ancient Persia. Some believe it stayed strictly local, too fragile to transport over long distances. Others argue that royal caravans moved it hundreds of miles, wrapped in straw and animal skins, to deliver to palaces far from the mountains or deserts. As you watch this little convoy trudge along the dusty road, you realize both theories might be true. What you're seeing is a smaller-scale version of what could have supplied entire cities. You walk alongside the donkeys, hearing the steady thud of hooves, the clink of wooden harness pieces, the faint slosh as meltwater seeps through the wrapping. The desert at dawn is eerily quiet, no wind yet, just the crunch of sand underfoot. It's strangely peaceful, and you start to understand why transporting ice was done so early: cooler air, softer light, fewer risks of spoilage. After a couple of hours, the group reaches a roadside rest area, little more than a mud brick hut and a shaded awning. Here, they open the bundles just enough to check the ice. You lean over to peek, still solid, though smaller. The men nod approvingly and repack it. They also scoop the meltwater into clay jars. Apparently, even the runoff is too precious to waste. By midday, the caravan reaches a slightly larger town, and here the atmosphere shifts. Word spreads quickly that the ice has arrived, and soon a small crowd gathers. The men haggle with a local merchant, who inspects the blocks carefully before agreeing to the trade: grain, dried fruit, and a few coins. You can see why ice was sometimes called white gold. It's valuable enough to buy food for the whole group. Standing there, you realize that this trade must have been a kind of seasonal lifeline. Ice could fetch high prices during heat waves, making it worth the effort of building and maintaining yakshals in the first place. It wasn't just for royal feasts or fancy treats, it was a genuine commodity, one that could support families, pay taxes, and keep local economies humming. As the deal wraps up, a town elder approaches with a polite request: could a small piece of the ice be set aside for the local healer? One of the men agrees, and a single block is carried reverently into a shaded room. You can't see what happens next, but you imagine it being placed on a patient's forehead or used to soothe a fever. It hits you just how life-saving this stuff must have been in a world without antibiotics, air conditioning, or 4 drips. Later, as the group heads back toward the village with lighter packs and fuller purses, you find yourself smiling. This whole experience feels strangely modern, like a supply chain before trucks and warehouses, a rural economy before spreadsheets. The desert wind picks up slightly, tugging at your clothes, and you let the dry air wash over you. When you finally get back to the yakshal that evening, the dome glows faintly in the starlight. You stand for a moment, looking at it with new respect. It's not just a clever building, it's the heart of an entire system that links farmers, merchants, healers, and travelers. And, of course, you can't help but whisper to yourself, eat your heart out, modern logistics companies. These folks figured out cold chain delivery centuries before you did. By now, you've seen the yakshal built, filled, maintained, and even turned into a marketplace for ice. But there's still one more layer to explore: the culture that grew around it. That evening, you're invited to sit with a few elders near the fire, and the conversation soon turns to stories, legends, superstitions, and local traditions tied to this strange desert refrigerator. One of the elders leans in and tells you that, long ago, people believed the yakshal had to be blessed each year or else the ice would refuse to freeze. You picture a dome throwing a stubborn tantrum and laugh softly, but you can tell from their serious nods that this was no joke. Offerings of milk, wine, or even flowers were sometimes poured into the shallow pools before the freezing nights began. Historians still argue whether this was purely ritual or if the organic matter helped seed the ice, making it form faster. Another elder swears that no one was allowed to quarrel near the yakshal. Angry words were thought to heat the air and spoil the season's crop of ice. You have to admit, it sounds like a pretty good excuse for keeping the peace in a small desert village. You glance at the dome nearby, looming softly in the moonlight, and can almost believe it's listening. As the fire crackles, someone else brings up a story about a traveling poet who once compared the yakshal to a sleeping camel, both patiently waiting through the night, both precious in the morning. The idea sticks with you. The dome really does feel like a creature, quietly doing its job, needing to be fed with water, cared for with repairs, and protected from neglect. Later, one of the younger villagers offers you a cup of chilled sharbat, and you sip it slowly, letting the icy sweetness coat your tongue. As you drink, you think about how these rituals and taboos gave people a sense of control over something as uncontrollable as desert heat. In a way, the yakshal wasn't just technology, it was part of their spiritual and social life, a kind of gathering place where everyone shared the responsibility of keeping the cold alive. You lie back on the sand and look up at the stars, which seem impossibly sharp in the dry air. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The desert feels vast, eternal, and yet here you are, in this tiny patch of human effort, where clay, water, and starlight come together to create ice. A gentle breeze stirs, and you wonder if it's passing through one of the yakshal vents, carrying with it the faint smell of cool straw. You imagine villagers hundreds of years ago doing exactly what you're doing now, lying on their backs, tired from the day's work, hoping tomorrow night will be cold enough to freeze another layer of water. You roll onto your side and think about how this communal rhythm must have shaped relationships here. People probably measured the year not just by harvests or religious festivals but by the first night ice formed, the day the chamber was finally sealed, and the week the last block was taken out. It's a cycle that bound them to one another as much as to the land. Before heading to bed, you take one last walk past the yakshal. The dome glows pale under the moon, its curved surface casting long, soft shadows. You press your hand against it, feeling the faint night chill. It feels almost alive, like the heartbeat of the village. And yes, you catch yourself smiling. In a way, this is ancient air conditioning, sure, but it's also an ancient calendar, a shrine, a market, and a social hub, all rolled into one. By now, the yakshal feels almost like an old friend, but today you learn about its role far beyond the village, because the Persian kings had big plans for this technology. As the sun rises, a traveler arrives with a scroll tucked under his belt and a gleam in his eye. He's a royal courier, and his stories spill out as he sips from a bowl of cooled milk, tales of imperial ice distribution that make your jaw drop. According to him, royal estates didn't just have one yakshal, they had entire networks of them, spread out along the major roads. Couriers like him could travel for days at a time and still find ice at staging posts. He swears the king's summer banquets featured dishes chilled with mountain ice, even hundreds of miles from where it was cut. Historians still argue whether this was possible on a large scale, but you can easily picture it, block after block of ice moving in a relay system, packed in straw, refreshed at every stop like a relay torch that never goes out. As the courier talks, you find yourself imagining a royal feast, platters of dates and melon glistening with frost, golden cups of wine cooled until beads of condensation run down their sides. Dancers whirl, musicians play, and the courtiers fan themselves lazily, each holding what might be the ancient world's first chilled cocktail. Somewhere, an engineer is standing smugly at the edge of the banquet hall, knowing it all began with a domed mud brick building in the desert. Of course, it wasn't just luxury. The courier insists that ice was sometimes sent to remote military outposts as a morale booster during long campaigns. You picture weary soldiers staring in disbelief as a chest of ice arrives in the middle of a sweltering summer, followed by the most glorious cold drink of their lives. For a moment, you imagine that one simple taste of winter might have been enough to keep an army's spirits from breaking. You walk with the courier to the yakshal so he can inspect the latest harvest. He seems genuinely impressed with the size of the ice pile, running a hand over the straw as though blessing it. Before leaving, he tucks a few smaller blocks into a leather-lined chest for the road. You notice how carefully he ties the chest shut, muttering under his breath as though asking the gods for a safe journey. The whole scene leaves you a little awestruck. The dome you've been exploring isn't just a local curiosity, it's part of a vast network that linked villages, cities, and palaces together in a surprisingly modern system. You think about how this must have looked on a map, dots of cold scattered across a blazing empire, connected by dusty roads and camel tracks. As the courier departs, you watch him disappear into the horizon, the chest of ice strapped securely to the donkey's back. The desert swallows him slowly, leaving you with the sound of wind rustling the straw walls around the freezing pool. You glance back at the Yakshal and suddenly see it differently. It's no longer just a clever trick for keeping ice. It's a piece of imperial infrastructure, a quiet participant in royal power, because whoever controlled the ice, controlled a kind of comfort no one else could offer. And yes, you can't resist a grin, this was probably the world's first luxury logistics service. Amazon Prime could never. As night falls, you sit under the stars again, this time feeling the weight of empire pressing in on the stillness of the desert. You sip slowly from a cup of water cooled with a fragment of royal ice, and for just a moment, you feel like a king. The next few days pass in a comfortable rhythm, but your curiosity isn't satisfied yet. You want to know what happened when empires faded, when the kings stopped sending couriers, when the roads fell silent. This morning, you walk out past the edge of the village, past the last irrigated fields, until you find a crumbling Yakshal half buried in sand. Its dome has collapsed, leaving a jagged ring of clay like a broken crown. You crouch at the edge and peer inside. The pit is partly filled with debris and wind-blown dust, but you can still make out the smooth, sloped sides leading downward. You feel a shiver, not from cold, but from the eerie sense of standing at the edge of forgotten technology. This is where you realize something: Yakshals didn't disappear overnight. Some were abandoned when new trade routes shifted, others when villages dwindled, and still others when more modern refrigeration methods arrived. Historians still argue over just how many survived into the modern era, but a few have been restored and even used again in rural Iran today. As you sit on a nearby rock, the wind whistling through the broken dome, you imagine the day this one was left behind. Maybe the last caretaker patched the cracks one final time, then walked away. Perhaps the chamber still held a small mound of ice that melted into silence under the sun, leaving nothing but damp earth. You run your hand over a fallen fragment of the dome and find it surprisingly smooth, as though time polished it. The clay smells faintly metallic when you break off a piece, and you wonder how many hands mixed this very soil centuries ago. The thought is oddly comforting: you're touching the same material they did, and in a way, still part of the cycle. As the afternoon heat builds, you imagine other ruins scattered across the landscape, some nearly intact, others reduced to faint mounds. They must look like giant anthills to travelers who don't know what they are. You picture a caravan stopping to camp beside one, the travelers wondering why someone built such a strange dome in the middle of nowhere. On your way back, you pass by the village's still functioning Yakshal and feel grateful that this one hasn't gone the way of its neighbor. The dome gleams softly in the late light, a survivor of centuries. It reminds you that some technologies aren't just clever, they're resilient. Back at the village, a few locals tell you that even after refrigerators became common, their grandparents kept the tradition of using the Yakshal for special occasions. Some even swore that water stored in it tasted better, cooler, fresher, somehow alive. You smile at that. Modern appliances hum and click, but they rarely inspire poetry. As evening falls, you sit quietly, staring at the sky's gradual shift to deep blue. The Yakshal behind you feels like a patient teacher, waiting for you to notice that the story isn't about ice at all, it's about memory, continuity, and people working together across centuries. And yes, you chuckle softly, apparently, even desert refrigerators get to retire. Tonight is your last night with the Yakshal, and the air feels especially calm, as if the desert itself knows you're about to leave. You decide to spend this night under the stars right next to the dome, to see it through until dawn. The villagers bring out a few mats and a clay lamp, placing it near the entrance so the soft glow catches the curve of the dome. Lying on your back, you watch the stars whirl overhead, the constellations sharp and endless. The dome rises like a shadowed mountain at your side, breathing silently through its hidden vents. You imagine the air currents moving inside, cool and steady, brushing against the stored ice as if to say, "Sleep, stay strong, you're safe for now." The night is quiet but never fully silent, there's the faint hiss of wind over sand, the occasional distant call of a jackal, and somewhere nearby, the soft drip of meltwater deep within the chamber. Each sound becomes part of a slow desert lullaby. Your thoughts drift to everything you've learned, the careful engineering, the communal rituals, the caravans carrying white gold across dusty plains. It's astonishing to think that all this effort was just to hold on to something so fleeting, ice that would eventually melt away. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the ice was never meant to last forever, only long enough to remind everyone that even in the harshest climate, people could make their own little pocket of winter. Historians still argue whether the yakshal was first invented as an accident, someone digging a pit for grain storage and realizing it stayed cold enough for ice, or as a deliberate feat of imperial engineering. You smile at the thought that maybe both are true. Maybe genius sometimes starts as a happy accident that someone cared enough to perfect. You sit up briefly, resting your hand against the dome one last time. It feels cool, solid, reassuring, like a quiet promise that even tomorrow, when you're gone, it will keep doing its job. The moon climbs higher, bathing everything in a pale glow. You take a slow breath, tasting the dry night air, feeling the faint chill creep across the ground as the desert radiates its heat into the sky. Somewhere inside, the ice shifts with a soft crackle, as though the yakshal itself is whispering goodnight. You finally lie down again, eyelids heavy, the stars beginning to blur. For a moment, you imagine the entire Persian desert dotted with glowing domes like this one, each one a keeper of cold, a little defiance against the sun. And with that image, you let yourself drift. The desert is perfectly still now, and the dome behind you seems to disappear into the night, becoming just another gentle curve in the landscape. Your breathing slows as the last traces of warmth leave the sand, and the stars hang like lanterns above you, endlessly patient. You imagine the ice resting inside, layered in straw, not melting but simply waiting, as if it knows its purpose. There's something deeply calming about that thought, about a structure designed only to protect something fragile until the right moment arrives. The night air grows cooler, brushing against your skin like silk. You let it remind you that you are safe here, far from the noise of cities and the rush of screens. Everything feels slower, quieter, like the entire world has paused just for you. You picture the builders who first shaped this dome with their hands, pressing clay against the desert wind, humming as they worked. You picture the generations who cared for it after, patching cracks, layering straw, whispering prayers over the pools of water at dusk. That rhythm continues even now, even as you lie here in the sand, letting time slip away. Your eyes grow heavier, and the dome becomes softer in your vision, almost glowing. The sounds of the night, wind, distant animals, the faint creak of clay, merge into a single, slow sound, like the earth itself breathing. You exhale once, deeply, and let go of the last bit of tension in your shoulders. The stars above seem to drift a little slower now, as though they, too, are ready to rest. You are exactly where you should be, and everything can wait until morning. Sleep well.